I guess we should have known that everyone who signs up to work for Donald Trump is signing up for one single project, and that is the transition of American democracy to a kind of kleptocratic oligarchy in which the billionaires rule, in which they get to steal from regular Americans. And if that's the domestic project, then the way that you normalize that kind of government is to associate yourself with similar governments abroad, like the Kremlin. So it's all part of one big domestic project. The foreign policy, the affection for dictatorships abroad is, in effect, a means towards transitioning our democracy to something very, very different, something we've never, ever seen before in this country.
Mr. Ambassador, that is all true. But the amazing thing about Putin and Russia, and it almost sets itself up like a bad joke, and I'm not a comedian, but how bad is he? He's so bad that even Donald Trump's massive propaganda arm, it starts at Fox News, but it has tentacles throughout radio and the internet and Elon Musk's company, cannot change this stubborn number, 81%. 81% of all Americans right now, today, do not like or trust Vladimir Putin. And that's after 9 years of this project that I think Chris Murphy accurately describes. Doesn't mean they'll give up, but what should people be prepared for in terms of trying to turn what is hardened and correct distrust and dislike for Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think the first comment I would make is the American people, at least 81%, have a better understanding of Russia and the threat that Putin poses than the president apparently does. You know, we've seen over the last 3 or 4 weeks what I would call concession after concession after concession to Moscow. So already 3 weeks ago, the president and the secretary of defense are talking about, well, Ukraine can't get its territory back. It can't join NATO. So before the president even has the Russians and the Ukrainians at the negotiating table, he's already making 2 big concessions to the Russians' view. For the last 3 years, there's been a Western agreement that we will isolate and boycott Putin, and then Trump agrees to meet with Putin. And then we had this, it's already been mentioned, the vote at the United Nations where we joined Russia, North Korea, and Iran to vote against a UN resolution because it mentioned Russia as the aggressor. And I look at this and I say, what has the United States received in return? And I can't see a single thing. And I fear that Trump is going about it all wrong in negotiating with Putin. Putin looks at the White House now and he sees weakness. And he's not inclined to make any concessions because he can just sit back and see what tomorrow will bring, and maybe there'll be another gift. This is not working even in the terms of President Trump's own professed goal, which is to try to find an end to the Russia-Ukraine war, because Russia sees no reason whatsoever to move. You know, President Trump heads the most powerful country in the world. He has leverage that he could impose on Putin to inflict costs if Putin continues this war. And thus far, for reasons that are very hard to understand, he's not chosen to use that leverage.
Peter Baker, a lot has been made of Trump's affinity, not just for Putin, but for the manosphere. It includes a bunch of men who look like Dan Bongino and Joe Rogan. I don't know who they all are, but the masculinity seems to be the beginning, the middle, and the end of all their stories. Here's how weak the Republicans and Trump look in front of their own voters. This is a caller to the Mark Levin radio show, and some voters in a Trump district, a district Trump won 52-47.
One thing that's really disturbed me today is all the people who are blaming Zelensky like he's the problem, like he's the villain in this story. And he's not. It's Putin. I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine did not invade Russia. And I am just perplexed at all these people who are saying that Zelensky's a crook or that Ukraine wants war.
Listen, everybody's freaking out. Everybody's like, you know, I'm Mr. Like, let's work together. Let's try and find common ground. And what happened in the White House yesterday, I was so pissed off that it was just so... I knew you had to get that out of your system. I wanted you to get that out of your system.
So, Peter, the point there, the man getting a standing ovation in a district Trump won 52-47, not a Republican, not a Trump cabinet member, not a man from the manosphere, but a Democrat.
Look, I think that it reminds us how people felt about the Ukraine war when the full-fledged invasion happened in 2022. Remember, Americans all across the board flew Ukrainian blue and yellow flags. There was a great deal of empathy and sympathy on the part of the American people for a nation that was invaded unprovoked, let's be honest about that, by its more powerful neighbor, simply because the more powerful neighbor's leader says it doesn't deserve to be an independent nation. Remember that, by the way, when you hear Russians or people who are sympathetic to Russia say it's really all about NATO expansion. Vladimir Putin wrote a 5,000-word treatise in July of 2021 saying, Ukraine historically is not an independent nation, doesn't deserve to be an independent nation. This is not about whether it's a member of NATO. It doesn't deserve to be on the map, as far as Vladimir Putin is saying. And Americans felt that at the time. Americans felt like the way they did when, the Nazis were invading Poland and so forth. Now, that doesn't mean that they want to necessarily spend, hundreds of billions of dollars, if that's what it comes to. There's certainly a part of America that is tired of being involved in other people's wars, and Trump taps into that sort of feeling. But there's a difference between that and suddenly taking sides with Vladimir Putin. That's not something that Americans have historically been in favor of. Just yesterday, I think CBS came out with a poll of YouGov showing that of those who had a choice, 55%, I think, said they prefer Ukraine over Russia. Only 4% said Ukraine, and 44%, I may have those numbers wrong, but something in that range, didn't take a position one way or the other. So a lot of people don't want to be involved. But if they do have a position, they're 10-1 in favor of Russia. Ukraine.
Ukraine. Here's the poll number I have. A lot of this Trump has made about spending. And even on spending, 65% of all Americans in the latest NPR PBS Marist poll say that we've either spent the right amount or not enough aiding our ally, Ukraine, in the war against Russia. 34% say we spent too much. Here's my question, and it's about politics. The cuts, not popular. Siding with Russia, 81% of all Americans don't like Russia very much. Inflation going the wrong direction. The stock market going the wrong direction. Trump has not kept a promise other than putting all the pieces in place for retribution and I guess dropping the case against Eric Adams, but I didn't hear him mention that in his stump speech very often. What is happening politically?
Well, it's interesting because people are still saying that he's doing what he said he would do. And I think primarily that's probably around immigration.
Deportations.
Because they're trying to do this big show, like they're really taking out people. And they're not removing anywhere near the number of people that they said they would remove on day one. And the other thing that's interesting politically is he's picked a fight with Canada. Now, keep in mind that Canada has intercepted more fentanyl coming across their border from the United States than we have coming from Canada. So he tried to blame Canada and say, well, you're not doing anything about drugs coming across our border. Meanwhile, Russia allows cyber criminals to operate with impunity in Russia. You don't think that Vladimir Putin can go in and murder all these cyber criminals that are shutting down hospitals in the United States? They're impacting manufacturing companies. They are doing cyber warfare. Russian actors are doing cyber warfare today in our country. Ask anybody in the intelligence community and they will tell you that. But for some reason, Donald Trump is not bothered by Russia letting their criminals wreak havoc with some of our most important institutions that deliver important services to America, but he picks a fight with Canada. Now, all of these chickens are going to come home to roost. And I'm using chickens because Easter's coming and everybody's not going to be able to decorate that many eggs because they're not going to be able to afford it. So eggs have become a symbol of Trump's failure, but it's one of many, and it's going to take a while. It will take 6 months, maybe a year. But if this continues the way it's going, there will not be good midterms for the Republican Party.
Is that the Democrats thinking that they need 6 months to a year to really mount a robust?
Well, I think the Democrats' thinking is probably no different than your thinking or my thinking. Horrified, feeling somewhat helpless, depressed. This is really a time where there's not one leader And so everyone's looking to people to rise up from a phoenix from the ashes, one figure that will lead us out of the desert and take on Donald Trump effectively. That will happen in time. But for now, I think the Democrats have to be disciplined about staying on the message of affordability and that your government is here to serve you. And if your government can't serve you because you can't get in the parks, you can't get your question answered by the IRS, you can't get your mother's Social Security check straightened out, that will all now be blamed on Donald Trump, not the deep state.
Zelensky, he met with European leaders this weekend after he left the U.S. The UK Prime Minister announcing a multi-billion-dollar aid package now for Ukraine. UK and European allies seem to be racing to try to fix this fracture between the U.S. and Ukraine. Will that work?
I don't know. It's hard to say, and fixing the fracture to what end and to how far, right? So they had, I think, a very good meeting. For anybody who cares about national security for Ukraine in Europe, they came up with new aid and an idea perhaps for a ceasefire and a peace agreement. And the Trump administration should be happy about that. They keep saying the Europeans need to do more. They're doing more. Number two, when it comes to repairing our bilateral relationship, of the 3 points that Garrett just laid out, let's just be clear. Two of them are points about personal differences. It's about the personalities, the whims of our president. That's not his job. His job is to represent American national security interests and leave his own personality out of it. And moreover, the notion that Zelensky needs to say thank you to the president and the vice president. He needs to say thank you to the American people. He's done that 1,000 times. But what have they done for him? Remember, they are giving Putin everything he wants before negotiations have started. They voted, Mr. Vance, as a senator, voted against the very aid package that he now wants to be thanked for. So I hope they'll just put aside the personal stuff and focus on very concretely the minerals deal. Point number two that Garrett just said. President Zelensky, his team has made it crystal clear they are ready to sign whenever, under what conditions. I hope President Trump and his team will do that immediately as a first baby step for repairing U.S.-Ukrainian relations.
We are seeing President Zelensky give thanks. He's been posting on X after that meeting that he is grateful for U.S. support, that he's thankful to President Trump despite that Oval Office meeting. Let's remind our viewers how that unfolded. Here's just part of it.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. What you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have. You're not winning. You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us. You have to be thankful. You don't have the cards.
Igor, as you reflect now on what went down, do you think Zelensky should have done anything differently there?
Well, Anna, if you remember, you've asked me what my advice would have been, and I said, resist the theatrics, but unfortunately I was wrong. Not in the sense that President Zelensky didn't resist the theatrics, but you know, the whole situation reminded me of that classic James Bond film. Remember when James Bond basically says, "Do you expect me to talk?" And the villain says, "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die." It was exactly like that. So I don't believe there was anything that Zelensky could have done differently for a different outcome. And to be honest, what's worrying here is not the actual meeting. I think, you know, there's a very fine line between pushing for peace and outright helping Russia. And certain things, some of them are not Ukraine related, like, for example, the infamous news about the Cyber Command stepping down against Russia recently. You know, I believe that line has been crossed. And therefore, I think President Zelensky needs to sign the mineral deal if it's on the table and if it's sane. President Zelensky needs to be open to this relationship, but, you know, there's only so much he can do. It's not personal. It's a bilateral relationship between two countries.
Ambassador, this fracture is also playing out domestically, with House Speaker Johnson over the weekend suggesting Zelensky may need to resign after what happened. Take a listen.
Well, something has to change. Either he needs to come to his senses and come back to the table in gratitude, or someone else needs to lead the country to do that.
Yet Republican Senator James Lankford defended Zelensky. So from a diplomatic perspective, how do you view domestic lawmakers openly debating whether Zelensky should continue to lead his country after clashing with President Trump?
It's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. The arrogance of the speaker to say that the democratically elected leader of Ukraine fighting for his existence, for his country, should resign. It's absolutely outrageous. It does no good. It doesn't help any national interest of the United States. I want to keep coming back to this. What is good for American national security? Leave the Ukrainians aside. This is no good for our American national security, and it's exactly what Putin has been wanting since he invaded Ukraine. So what team are we on? Have we switched to the Russian side? Because I don't think the American people want to go along with President Trump and the speaker to end up on the Russian side, the side of dictatorship against democracy. 81% of the American people don't trust Putin. And I think the president is playing with fire if he tries to move us in that direction. I think it's going to backfire. You're already seeing it in town halls. You're already seeing protests when the vice president goes skiing about Ukraine. I think they're seriously misjudging the American people. We are not so foolish as to think that it's in America's interest to join the autocrats and throw under the bus the Democrats.
Yeah, we're showing some of that video from those protests over the weekend. This is what Vice President J.D. Vance faced when he went skiing with his family. You see these protesters holding Ukrainian flags and signs. This was a weekend ski trip in Vermont. Igor, what's the reaction inside Ukraine? How are Ukrainians feeling in this moment?
Well, first of all, we're seeing a major rally around the flag effect now. I mean, everyone is behind the president. Even some of the fierce opposition leaders are either remaining quiet or are openly speaking in support of President Zelensky. Secondly, it's nobody's business who our democratically elected president is. Only Ukrainians decide that. And that's exactly why we're fighting the Russians. The Russians wanted to decide for us. Tough luck, that's not going to happen. But I have some good news as well. I think it was Vice President Vance who said that Ukraine does, or President Trump who said Ukraine doesn't have any cards. We're not playing cards. I fully agree with my president. But at the same time, I think they're wrong. Ukraine has a number of cards it can play. And if we ever want to surrender, I'm pretty sure President Zelensky will travel to Moscow rather than Washington.
Ambassador, we have seen the U.S. do things, say things to try to get on Putin's good side, it would seem, including, we learned, stopping the cyber operations against Russia, which apparently took place before Friday's meeting with Zelensky. And I know Igor mentioned those earlier, but there's also President Trump calling Zelensky a dictator, other Russia-friendly rhetoric we've been hearing. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was asked about that yesterday, and take a listen to his response.
We've spent 3 years calling Vladimir Putin names. That's not the point now. The point that we're at now is we're trying to get the man to a table. That's the goal here. It's that simple. Can we try to sit with them and figure out whether there's anything, what are the Russians' demands? Under what conditions would the Russians be willing to stop this war? And as I said, we don't know what those are because we haven't talked to them in 3 years.
The goal, get them to the table. What's your response to Rubio's argument or the strategy that he is laying out there?
First of all, if they were actually serious about trying to mediate an end to this war, and I want to underscore, I'm not sure they are serious about that. But if they were, the first move would be to increase military assistance to Ukraine, to create a stalemate on the battlefield. Wars end in two ways. One side wins or there's a stalemate. If you want to create the permissive conditions for an actual peace negotiation, that is your first move. They're doing exactly the opposite. Second, to your point, they have thrown all kinds of concessions at Vladimir Putin before negotiating. So they said Ukraine can't join NATO. They said President Zelensky has to give up territory. They said there won't be American soldiers as part of this. They've cut foreign assistance to independent media. They've invited President Putin to join the G7. I could go on and on and on. There's no evidence whatsoever that any of this is working. And the fact that he doesn't know what they think, he just spent 4 hours with Foreign Minister Lavrov. I have yet to see one concrete step that they've taken to put pressure at all on Vladimir Putin. Right now, it's complete capitulation. And I've negotiated with these guys. I've negotiated with the Putin administration. Capitulation does not work. They just put that in their pocket and they demand more. And you're already seeing that in the Russian press. They've already pocketed all those concessions. And now they want more. They want the Ukrainians to limit their army to under 100,000. They want the Ukrainians to not import weapons anymore. They want to de facto turn Ukraine into a vassal state. And oh, by the way, they also want Zelensky to be removed. Isn't it strange that all of a sudden Americans are now saying the same thing?
Former Ambassador Michael McFaul and Igor Novikov, thank you both for coming on back. I appreciate the conversation.
When a school-age child died of the measles in West Texas last week, HHS Secretary RFK Jr. downplayed the outbreak, calling it, quote, not unusual. Never mind the fact that no one had died of measles in the United States in a decade. Since then, though, the past week, cases are continuing to pile up, including in New Jersey. And now RFK Jr. is amending himself ever so slightly, writing in a Fox News op-ed, quote, this situation has escalated rapidly, and adding, quote, all parents should consult with their healthcare providers to understand their options to get the MMR vaccine. Joining us now is senior scholar at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, Dr. Amish Adalja. All right, Amish Adalja, I'm sorry. Measles vaccine. Can you say what RFK is refusing to say?
The measles vaccine is the solution to this outbreak, and RFK Jr. is kind of going around that. He's not really giving it a full-throated defense. He's giving it a very kind of anemic, kind of perfunctory type of position on it, when he should be doing what, for example, Trump's first HHS Secretary, Alex Azar, did during the first administration, where it was a very full-throated, very aggressive defense saying, this is the solution, this is the way out of this is why the outbreak occurred, but you're not really seeing that, and I think it's what you would expect.
Why not?
I think it's because he's shown who he is for the last several decades. We know that he's an anti-vaccine activist. We know he is aligned with people who have said that the MMR vaccine causes autism. He wouldn't even disavow that during his confirmation hearings. He wants to make a statue to Andrew Wakefield, who was the guy who made that false statement. So this isn't somebody who actually believes in what he's writing there. I think he's written it maybe for political reasons, and that's what you're getting, is that kind of a response. That's what you would expect from someone like that.
So when you hear measles, you think, oh, God, it's going to be something like the chicken pox. I'll get over it. I'll be fine if I get it. Or, most kids will be fine. Or if they survive it, then they'll be fine. There's some new literature out there, new studies that show that the measles does something that has longer-term ramifications. Can you explain?
So the measles virus doesn't just cause a rash and a runny nose and red eyes. It actually affects your immune system. It actually deletes some of the memory that you have to other pathogens, other infectious disease. So after you get measles, your immune system is kind of crippled, hobbled for some time when it responds to any other type of infectious disease. So this is not something you want.
So it means, like, when you're a kid, you're building up a giant immunity, a set of immunities from all of the various viruses that you pick up in elementary school and you pick up in daycare and whatnot. And so if you get the measles and you survive it and you're 16 years old and you come across a pathogen that you would normally be able to overcome pretty easily, are you suddenly struggling?
Yes, your immune system, your immune response is blunted now. It's been sort of taken a couple steps back because of what measles has done. It's deleted. It literally deletes and kills certain cells that would be there to respond to those infections.
Okay, so remind us again, if you want to get the measles shot, you haven't yet gotten one, what is the normal schedule for measles shots?
So usually children get measles, the vaccine, between 12 and 15 months, and then again around 5 to 7 years of age. You can sort of adjust that a little bit. They're not ironclad, but those are the times when people get vaccinated.
How can you adjust it? Say you have a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old and you want to get them that second shot to build that immunity.
You can call the pediatrician and get it early. They can move it up. It's not really that big of a deal if they get it when they're age 4 or age 5. And certainly if you're living in an outbreak area, it might make sense to have the added protection. And remember, there's a bunch of people that didn't get a second dose because that second dose was added around late 1980s or so. So there's people that were born before then who got one dose, which is good, but not completely optimal. So if you're going to Texas, if you're traveling internationally where there's lots of measles, you may want to get that second dose as well.
What about a booster? I mean, would it be available to me if I wanted a booster and I had those 2 shots? Would it be necessary? Would it be helpful?
It wouldn't be harmful. I don't know if it would actually help you if you're already fully immune with 2 doses of the vaccine. This is one of our most effective vaccines. This is what keeps measles at bay. And I think if you're fully immunized, unless you've had some kind of immunocompromising condition, like you've had a transplant or something, there's no reason to get a third dose of it, but it's not going to hurt you if you get a third dose.
Using myself as the stand-in for everyone else. Dr. Amesh Adalja, thank you so much for joining us in person today. We appreciate it.
Joining us now, Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. She's a member of the Senate Appropriations, Commerce, and Health Committees. Very good to have you here with us this morning.
Great to be here.
So since you're on the Appropriations Committee, you're the perfect person to ask. Is the continued impoundment by DOJ of funds authorized and appropriated by Congress, is that a constitutional violation of Article 1 powers?
It absolutely is. And it is so clear in Article 1 that Congress makes the laws, passes the budgets and the appropriation bills, and it is the administration, the president, who implements and administers those. And we're seeing conflict there. Started with that federal funding freeze. And of course, lawsuits were filed immediately, but the harm occurred. We had Head Starts in Wisconsin that closed, 250 families in Waukesha, Wisconsin, displaced for a week because they couldn't access the federal funding to run their Head Start program. And in the courts, of course, we got a stay of those freezes. We got a rescission of the OMB directive.
Has the funding started back?
It has. Most of the portals have reopened. However, some were so archaic in terms of the IT infrastructure that they didn't open immediately, even though I think the intent was to. But we're seeing impoundment in other areas. We're seeing, the closure of agencies like USAID, and, firing people, not necessarily impoundment, but this is by an unelected, unaccountable organization. I mean, we got to remember DOJ, the Department of Government Efficiency, is not an official organization of any sort. And Elon Musk, they claim, is not the head of it, but he clearly is calling the shots. He's not elected.
Right.
There's no accountability here. And some of the contracts that have been canceled have resulted in business going to his operations. Corruption at the highest levels right there out in the open.
So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but I think this is important for viewers to know. Not only does this seem to be unconstitutional because these are Article 1 powers, it also breaks the law. When the impoundment law. When Nixon tried to impound funds, Congress passed a law in 1974, the Impoundment Act of 74, that explicitly states a president can't do this.
Exactly. And I think they are trying to break it to create a case that they ultimately bring up to the Supreme Court. And I hope the Supreme Court would stand firmly with Article 1 and the Impoundment Act. But I think his top advisors have said that they think it's unconstitutional. And we will probably see this play out at some point during this Trump term.
So, by the way, if I can just say, none other than William Rehnquist said that the impounding of funds by the president was a breach of Article 1 powers.
Yeah,
William Rehnquist.
Not exactly.
And Justice Roberts will be key in this, in terms of the integrity of the court. And so we hope he's paying close attention to this.
Right. Yeah, we will have to watch there. You obviously won in Wisconsin State that Donald Trump also won. These cuts here we're talking about, it's also slashing like Alzheimer's disease research, other health issues. Do you think that the people who voted for Donald Trump, this is what they cast their ballot for? Because there's also rumors of Medicaid cuts. We might even hear from Trump in his speech tomorrow night to Congress.
On Medicaid and Medicare, Trump a little over a week ago said on Fox News, I'm not touching Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And he said it multiple times. The next morning, he endorsed the Republican House budget, which calls for nearly $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid.
How does that impact rural health care in Wisconsin and across the country? It will
devastate critical access hospitals in rural areas. Nursing homes will have to close. Remember that 8 million seniors depend on Medicaid, especially when they need skilled nursing care. And a third of all children are on Medicaid. Adults with disabilities often are on Medicaid for their health care and transportation needs. And so I can tell you our phones are ringing off the hook. My guest for the State of the Union tomorrow will be a woman with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer who relies on Medicaid for her treatment. She is terrified about the possible impacts of a cut to Medicaid because it will mean either she and her family go bankrupt or she'll stop treatment.
Senator, I wanted to ask you about Democrats finding their voice and footing against this. None of us in civics class, none of us in college were quite prepared for what we're seeing now. This kind of anti-constitutional coup, this unelected billionaire dictating policy, standing in the cabinet office talking about accidentally cutting Ebola funding. But I think a lot of people have felt like Democrats don't quite know how to speak to quite this level of severity. And I think a lot of people I meet feel very undefended. They feel kind of rampaged by the right and undefended by the left. I know you and your colleagues are doing things are being done, there are meetings, there are committees, but at just a very visceral level, I would say most lay Democrats that I meet feel just very undefended, feel it's not clear, there's no briefings, there's no shadow cabinet, a lot of different ideas have been proposed. Do you think there's truth in that feeling, even though you and your colleagues are doing something? And how close are Democrats to figuring out a way to respond to this moment that would address that? So
Steve Bannon and Steve Miller, advising the president, said, we are going to flood the zone. And we're seeing that. And we've never, how many announcements each day, that, and especially on Friday nights and over the weekends. But there are sort of three-pronged strategy for all of this, and that is the courts. We're just talking about the strategy in the courts to make sure that these actions are constitutional and lawful, and the Congress. And we're limited in what we can do because we're in the minority in both houses, but you do require a supermajority to pass most laws in the Senate. So 60 votes, we have leverage there. And our constituents. And as I said, my phones are ringing off the hook. We're organizing folks and saying, don't just call me, call my Republican counterpart, call your congresspeople. They're attending these town hall meetings are because people are organizing and understand the critical nature of their voice. And I just think back to the first Trump administration. It was the people and the Congress and the Democrats who saved the Affordable Care Act. And we're going to have to do the same on Medicaid. We're going to have to do the same against DOJ's indiscriminate firing of people who keep our veterans healthy, who keep our airspace safe, and are on the front lines of fighting the avian flu outbreak.
Just on the question of making people feel defended.
Yes.
And have communication. Do you think there's a role for maybe the Democrats appointing one person, a gifted communicator, a Pete Buttigieg, or someone else to do a daily briefing, something to actually centralize all these many good things that are happening, but a lot of people are not feeling like they know what the Democrats' response is.
So I have long faulted my own party for not being as message focused as my Republican counterparts, who will go and say the same thing over and over again. But we're getting there. We've held the floor. We've held more all-nighters than I've had since college, just in the last couple of weeks, on the floor, holding the floor, talking about some of the nominees that are very dangerous, as well as noting the consequence of proposals like cutting Medicaid.
So Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Great.
Elon Musk says Doge is saving billions, but the numbers don't quite add up. New York Times reports that for the second time in a week, Musk's group has deleted hundreds more claims from its, quote, wall of receipts, erasing $4 billion in savings they made, or they say they made, for taxpayers. And on the agency's mission to root out fraud, the Washington Post finds it hasn't been able to point to much fraud at all. The Post's Philip Bump puts it bluntly, the point of this exercise, it's safe to assume, is not cost-cutting, but to decimate government so that Trump can rebuild it to his liking. To some extent, Musk is running a con. Joining us now, Washington Post national columnist Philip Bump. Phil, really good to have you. They're putting up all these numbers, and then they're erasing the numbers, and then they're putting up more numbers. Sometimes they're adding something up 3 times. They're overestimating a contract. They're claiming a contract cancellation saves money when it doesn't, in fact, save any money. Is there anything that they've been able to do so far that does save taxpayers money, that is an example of fraud?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to consider those two questions separately, right? Have they done things that might save taxpayers money? Assuming we're talking about federal spending as being a tax savings, then yes, it seems clear that if you cancel contracts wantonly, then you're going to save on money that you would have spent on those contracts. Of course, when we talk about cost savings, you and I can save money by not paying our rent or our mortgage, right? There's a downside, which is that we lose our house. So, when we talk about savings, it's very easy to simply not pay bills. The challenge is, what are you doing that for? What are you paying for in the first place? And what's the net loss for taxpayers? Then on the other side, we have this idea of fraud and waste. So far, what we've seen from Musk's group is not that they're uncovering fraud and waste in the traditional sense of, like the $6,000 hammer or whatever it was during the Clinton administration, where it was obviously the case that you could get something cheaper, but the costs were being ballooned. We're not seeing that. What we're seeing instead is examples of contracts being ended that do not align with the right-wing politics of Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And so when they're talking about waste and fraud, the only examples that they're pointing to are examples that play to their base of things that their base doesn't like, not actually necessarily waste on the part of the government.
But this is also what they're pointing to when they're talking about their budget deal, and part of the way that they're going to save taxpayers money and not add to the deficit, give them tax breaks but not add to the deficit, and not cut into Medicare and Social Security, is because they're going to save so much money in fraud. Could they save so much money in fraud? Is there enough fraud in the federal government to be uncovered to get them to that number?
Well, it's important to remember we used to have people who did a diligent job of trying to uncover that fraud. These were the inspectors general. These were the committees in the House that were tasked with actual oversight, that actually used to do oversight over the government. And now we don't have that same sort of rigorous mechanism in place, in part because Donald Trump fired the inspectors general, in part because the oversight committees run by Republicans who are mostly focused on targeting Democrats. And so we don't have people who are actually looking for those things. So it's hard to say how much fraud and waste there is. Of course, there is some money that is being spent that doesn't need to be spent. Like, no one can say that you're spending, $8 trillion and none of that is unwarranted. The challenge is it's akin to the conversation you were just having about RFK. Yes, people agree that the government health system isn't necessarily working right, but RFK is coming in and just blowing the whole thing up. It's not as though he has a mechanism for fixing it. That's the same approach that Elon Musk is taking to government spending. Yes, there are certainly examples where we're probably spending more than we ought to, but instead of going through a deliberate process to uncover that, we're going and blowing everything up, and Elon Musk is doing so largely because he can then put it on X, the social media platform, and get a lot of retweets and shares.
I want to put up what we just had on the screen, the numbers claimed saved and then the numbers that were actually saved. So this ICE contract that they said was worth $8 billion, actual worth was $8 million, so from a B to an M. It's a big difference. USAID contract,
times, right?
Yeah, USAID contract nearly $2 billion. It's actually just $18 million. The Social Security Administration $232 million, actually just $560,000. Those are incredibly off numbers. There's a giant disparity between those two numbers. How do they get to $8 billion when it's $8 million? Is it just a typo?
Yeah, in that case, it's believed it actually was a typo, that there was either they had scanned the information wrong or they're looking at an old version of the contract that was erroneous that added those 3 extra zeros to it. So, yeah, in some cases that is it. In other cases, as you noted at the top of the segment, you talked about the fact that, they were counting things that had already been paid as savings because, if there's a contract for 10 years and you've already paid 9 years of it, they're saying they ended the contract and claiming the entire amount that had been spent. It is both sloppiness and over-eagerness to try and show a big number that's leading to this, when at the same time, there's no reason to do it this fast, right? Like, I think it's really important to come back to that point. Like, there is a way to do this where you're actually being careful and attentive and not just firing people willy-nilly and not just slashing contracts by doing a keyword search in the actual documentation and being deliberate about it. But that's not the approach that they're taking. And so no one should have any confidence in any of this, that they're actually finding something that meets the putative standard that they set, because they've not gone through a process that would mean that they would be able to do that.
Phil Bump, really good to have you. Thank you very much.